What if I told you the balance of global power is shifting? And it's not happening in Washington, London, or Paris, but in Johannesburg, Sao Paulo, Shanghai, and New Delhi. What if I told you that the alliance quietly rewriting the rules of global economics isn't NATO, the IMF, or the EU? It's BRICS. Most people still see BRICS as a loose club of developing nations, but that's a mistake. Because this bloc, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, isn't just trading goods, it's trading in the future. Let me ask you something. Do you realize what happens when the majority of the world's population starts coordinating outside the dollar system? When they build their own financial networks, their own banks, their own terms of development? That's not just a headline, that's an earthquake. And Africa is standing right at the epicenter. BRICS began as an acronym, a Goldman Sachs invention in the early 2000s to describe fast-growing economies. But what started as an economist's buzzword has become a geopolitical force. The bloc's members now represent over 40% of the global population and nearly a third of the world's GDP. Together, they control vast reserves of energy, minerals, food, and manufacturing power, the very foundations of modern civilization. And more importantly, they share one thing: a refusal to let Western institutions define their destiny. Think about how the post-World War II world was built. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank dictated who gets loans, the US dollar ruled global trade, and Western powers decided which nations qualified for development. For decades, Africa was told to follow their script: privatize, liberalize, stabilize. But somehow always remained in debt, always dependent, always emerging. BRICS says, enough. This coalition was born out of frustration, but it's growing out of ambition. In 2006, the foreign ministers of Brazil, Russia, India, and China met to discuss deeper cooperation. 2 years later, the global financial crisis hit, exposing how fragile and biased the Western economic order really was. Suddenly, the idea of a new system, one not dictated by Wall Street or Brussels, started to make sense. By 2010, South Africa joined, bringing the voice of Africa into the room. That move was strategic, not symbolic. It turned BRIC into BRICS and made it a truly global counterbalance. Now, let's get something straight. BRICS isn't just about opposing the West. It's about offering an alternative. And that distinction matters. It's about building new institutions that reflect today's realities, not yesterday's empires. Take the new Development Bank, for instance, a financial institution created by BRICS in 2014 to fund infrastructure and sustainable projects across the global south. No austerity traps, no hidden conditionalities, just development on terms defined by the countries themselves. That's revolutionary in practice, not just in rhetoric. African nations are watching closely, from Nigeria to Egypt to Ethiopia, because for the first time, they see a platform that treats them as equals, not clients. When Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso talks about sovereignty and self-determination, it echoes the same spirit that drives BRICS: independence from systems built to exploit, not empower. And here's where it gets even more interesting. BRICS has started discussions about a common trading currency, one that could bypass the US dollar entirely. It's not just an economic move, it's psychological warfare against financial dependency. Because whoever controls the currency controls the narrative. The dollar has been the invisible leash around the global South's neck for decades. Every sanction, every interest rate hike, every dollar shortage, all of it ripples through African markets, forcing governments to choose between stability and survival. If BRICS manages to create an alternative settlement system, digital or otherwise, it could liberate countries from that chokehold. Imagine African nations trading with Asia and South America using a currency not weaponized against them. Imagine development funds that don't demand your sovereignty in return. That's the promise on the table, and it's why the West is nervous. But this isn't just theory. You can already see the shift. Saudi Arabia, Iran, the UAE, Ethiopia, and Egypt joined BRICS Plus in 2024. That's massive. We're talking about the world's largest oil producers aligning with one of Africa's most strategic economies and the cradle of civilization itself. It's not a coincidence. It's a declaration. The old order is dying, and with that the question becomes, who replaces it? The West built global influence on institutions. BRICS is building it on relationships, on shared experiences of exploitation, on mutual benefit instead of conditional charity. For African leaders like Traoré and Assimi Goïta, this isn't about ideology, it's about dignity. They see BRICS as the diplomatic embodiment of what their revolutions fight for: the right to define one's own future without asking for permission. Because make no mistake, the future is multipolar. And Africa is not a spectator, it's a stakeholder. The rise of BRICS isn't just a headline in financial journals. It's a warning shot to the IMF, to NATO, to every neo-colonial structure still pretending to be a development partner. The Global South has been paying attention, and it's ready to collect what it's owed. The old world was built on extraction, raw materials in, cheap loans out, but the new world is being built on cooperation. The more these nations trade and invest with each other, the less they need Western approval. The less leverage the dollar has, the less power the old empires can exert. That's what makes BRICS so dangerous to the status quo and so promising to everyone else. And when you see the momentum, you realize this isn't some economic alliance playing dress-up as a political force. It's an awakening. That awakening is happening faster than most analysts expected. In just a few years, BRICS has transformed from a talking point into an engine of coordination. And while Western commentators keep debating whether it can really work, BRICS countries are already signing deals, funding infrastructure, and integrating their payment systems. You won't see that on CNN, but you'll feel it every time a nation settles trade in its own currency instead of dollars. That's not rebellion, that's evolution. Let's look at the math. BRICS nations now contribute over 32% of global GDP when measured by purchasing power parity. That's more than the G7. Together, they produce most of the world's iron ore, cement, steel, and energy. China is the manufacturing powerhouse. Russia controls massive reserves of oil and gas. India brings tech, human capital, and pharmaceuticals. Brazil feeds the world. And South Africa? It anchors the African continent, the next frontier of global growth. Combine that with newcomers like Saudi Arabia and Iran, and you've got a network that controls both the energy pipelines and the shipping lanes that keep the global economy alive. This isn't about bragging rights, it's about leverage. Because power doesn't come from speeches, it comes from control of resources, production, and distribution. And that's exactly what BRICS is quietly assembling. Meanwhile, the West keeps trying to downplay it, calling it a loose coalition, divided by ideology, lacking unity. But that's projection. The G7 itself can't agree on how to manage its own crises. From immigration to inflation, BRICS, on the other hand, doesn't need uniformity. It thrives on diversity. Each member has a different political system, but they share one objective: end the monopoly of Western dominance over development and decision-making. And that's where Africa enters the story again, not as a beneficiary, but as a catalyst. African leaders are realizing they don't have to choose between aid and isolation. There's a third path now: partnership. In 2023 and 2024, dozens of African countries applied or expressed interest in joining BRICS or aligning with its projects. That's not coincidence, it's strategy. After decades of development partnerships that left nations poorer, people are looking for cooperation without humiliation. Take Ethiopia. Despite being under immense economic strain, it joined BRICS in 2024, signaling a rejection of dependency and a turn toward multipolar diplomacy. That's a bold move for a country that's been pressured by Western financial systems for years. Egypt's inclusion is just as symbolic. A country that sits on one of the world's most strategic waterways, the Suez Canal, now tied directly to a bloc that wants to reshape trade routes entirely. And then there's the African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, the sleeping giant. Imagine when that fully aligns with BRICS trade structures. You'd have a continental market of over 1.4 billion people connecting to Asia and South America through direct partnerships. No middlemen, no IMF reforms, just commerce on equal footing. Now, The Western establishment isn't taking this lightly. You've seen it. Sudden smear campaigns, warnings about debt traps, and think tank reports questioning BRICS sustainability. But those narratives collapse under scrutiny. Because here's the truth. The debt trap wasn't invented by China or BRICS. It's been perfected by the Bretton Woods system since 1944. What BRICS offers isn't charity, it's choice. And that's what terrifies the global elite. When nations can choose their partners, they're no longer manageable. When they can fund their own infrastructure through the new development bank instead of the IMF, they can say no to predatory conditions. When they trade in currencies other than the dollar, sanctions lose their bite. That's why BRICS is not just an alliance, it's a shield. But don't misunderstand, BRICS isn't flawless. It faces challenges, internal rivalries, economic disparities, political differences. These are real. India and China, for instance, have long-standing tensions. Brazil's politics swing back and forth, and some members struggle with inflation or governance issues. Critics love to point to that as proof that BRICS will eventually collapse. But that assumes these nations need to agree on everything to succeed. They don't. The West didn't either when it built its order. What matters is that their shared interest, sovereignty, outweighs their differences. And sovereignty is contagious. Look at the Sahel. Countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger are redefining what it means to stand on their own. When Traoré talks about building an economy that serves the Burkinabe people, not French corporations, he's echoing the same logic that drives BRICS nations: self-determination before dependency. The Sahel Alliance and BRICS aren't directly linked yet, but ideologically, they're speaking the same language. That's what makes this moment so powerful. For the first time in centuries, the global South isn't asking for a seat at someone else's table. It's building its own. And the message is simple. Africa isn't the world's raw material warehouse anymore. It's the next engine of innovation, energy, and strategy. But it's not just about economics. BRICS is also shifting political gravity. Think about how global diplomacy used to work. The UN Security Council, the G7, the OECD. Those clubs decided global priorities without genuine representation from the majority of humanity. BRICS is rewriting that. Its summits attract dozens of observers, leaders, and ministers from across the global South, each one looking for a way out of economic subjugation. And they're finding it, quietly, steadily, persistently. Because what's forming isn't just an alliance, it's a movement, a new understanding that economic sovereignty and political freedom are inseparable, that you can't claim independence while your currency is dictated by Washington, or your infrastructure depends on loans designed to fail. It's no longer radical to say that. It's rational. The global South is learning that sovereignty isn't declared. It's built through trade routes, technology, and trust between nations that share common scars. BRICS is giving those nations the scaffolding to build on. That scaffolding is growing stronger every year. The new development bank keeps expanding its lending portfolio, issuing billions in local currencies instead of dollars. That's a quiet revolution because it dismantles the monopoly of the greenback without firing a single shot. Countries like South Africa and Brazil can now finance projects in their own currency, shielding themselves from the volatility of US interest rates. It might sound technical, but this is where real sovereignty begins, in control over credit, not just control over borders. When nations can borrow, trade, and invest without being trapped in the web of Western finance, they start to think differently. They start planning long-term. They start building for themselves, not for export markets that underpay and overexploit. That's the foundation of independence, and that's why BRICS, for all its internal challenges, matters more than any single policy or leader. It's not about replacing one empire with another, it's about dismantling the system of empire itself. You see that mindset in the conversations African leaders are now having. 10 years ago, many of them were still begging for foreign direct investment and development aid. Now they're talking about joint ventures, industrialization, and resource control. The tone has changed. The confidence has changed. When Traoré stands before his people and says, "We have the right to decide for ourselves," that's not isolationism. That's strategic alignment with a world that's finally moving beyond domination. The beauty of BRICS lies in its subtlety. It doesn't demand loyalty pledges or military bases. It invites collaboration. That's why it's so attractive to nations tired of coercion disguised as partnership. From Latin America to Southeast Asia, governments are studying the BRICS model, not to copy it, but to mirror its spirit. A multipolar world isn't one where everyone agrees. It's one where no one can be bullied. And let's be honest, the resistance to that idea is fierce. Western powers aren't going to watch their influence erode without a fight. You can already see the countermeasures: new trade restrictions, renewed propaganda about authoritarian alliances, and diplomatic pressure on smaller nations to stay within the old system. But history has a rhythm. The same tactics that worked in the 1980s won't work in the 2030s. People are more informed, leaders are more assertive. The myth of Western benevolence is collapsing under its own hypocrisy. When the United States freezes billions of dollars belonging to sovereign nations, when Europe enforces sanctions that starve entire populations, the rest of the world takes note. They see that the rules-based order only applies when it benefits those who wrote the rules. BRICS, by contrast, offers flexibility. It's messy, but it's fairer. It allows space for countries to breathe, to experiment, to fail and recover without being lectured or punished. Now imagine what this means for Africa in the next decade. If BRICS expands its infrastructure funding, if it integrates African banking systems into its payment networks, if it connects with the African Union's Agenda 2063, we could witness a continental transformation unlike anything since independence. Railways connecting ports across borders, energy grids built for Africans, not for export, value chains that keep wealth on the continent. That's what real sovereignty looks like, not symbolic flag waving, but tangible control over production and prosperity. And there's another layer: cultural confidence. The psychological shift that comes when Africans see their nations treated as equals in global forums. When a Burkinabe farmer, a Nigerian entrepreneur, or a Kenyan engineer realizes that their destiny isn't tied to Western approval, but to cooperation with other sovereign nations, that changes everything. It reignites pride, ambition, and creativity. The world's narrative about Africa has long been written elsewhere. BRICS gives Africa the microphone. Now some will argue that China's dominance within BRICS could just replace one dependency with another. That's a valid concern. And it's exactly why Africa must approach this partnership with strategy, not blind trust. The key difference is leverage. Africa has what everyone needs: minerals, labor, land, and youth. If African leaders negotiate wisely, if they coordinate regionally and insist on fair terms, BRICS can become a platform for mutual gain, not manipulation. But that requires unity, something that leaders like Traoré and Goïta are starting to emphasize. Pan-Africanism isn't just a dream anymore, it's a necessity. And here's where every viewer needs to understand their role. This isn't just geopolitics, it's personal. Because when your government signs deals that determine how your country trades, who funds your infrastructure, and what currency backs your savings, it affects you. The rise of BRICS is about reclaiming agency at every level, national and individual. Africans must stay informed, engaged, and vocal about what kind of future they want in this new global order. The West will tell you BRICS is chaotic, that it lacks a clear vision. But look closely, that's the point. It's organic, it's evolving, it's not built to control, it's built to connect. That's how real power grows, quietly, collectively, and inevitably. When nations start saying no to old systems, the world shifts. When they start saying yes to each other, it transforms. So if you've ever wondered whether BRICS is just another acronym, remember this: it's the first genuine crack in a wall that stood for centuries. A wall built on exploitation, inequality, and dependence. And through that crack, a new light is coming through, one shaped by the global south, led by those who refuse to kneel anymore. The question now isn't whether BRICS will succeed, it's whether the rest of the world is ready for what happens when it does. Because once the global south stops asking permission, the world will never look the same again. And if you believe Africa deserves to stand tall in that new world, then this conversation isn't optional, it's essential. So, drop your thoughts below. Do you believe BRICS can truly liberate the global south from financial control? Or will the old powers find new ways to maintain their grip? Let's talk about it. And if this resonated with you, hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more deep dives into Africa's path to sovereignty. Because this story, Africa's story, is only just beginning.